Hello, I'm Richard Orme. This presentation is part of a series by UKAAF, the UK Association for Accessible Formats. The presentations introduce accessible formats, including Braille, large print, audio, EPUB, Office documents, and PDF. I serve on the board of UKAAF, but my day job is with the DAISY Consortium, an international non-profit organisation working to improve access to information for people with print disabilities. In that role, I work with disability organisations, accessibility experts, education organisations, technology companies and publishers. And a lot of our work is focused on technologies for accessible publications and curriculum materials. This presentation is all about EPUB, the format developed by the publishing industry for ebooks and other digital publications. And during this presentation, I'll be covering the following topics. What is EPUB and what's happening with EPUB standards? What resources are there for learning about EPUB and what important developments are happening with EPUB? There'll be a demonstration of EPUB, working together with assistive technology. We'll cover some case studies, and you'll learn how you can take the next step with EPUB. So, what is EPUB? Well, disability organisations have been making digital books actually since the late 80s, but mainstream digital ebooks hit in the early 2000s. And in developing the new standards for this industry, it was a collaboration between the publishers, the technology sector, and the disability community all working together. Publishers, well, they wanted a single file that they could distribute into the different distribution networks. They didn't want to have to produce different versions of a publication for lots of the different distribution channels. The technology companies, well, they needed content that would display well on any device that they made. So whether that's a desktop computer, a laptop computer, a tablet, or a smartphone. And the disability community wanted to make sure that these new digital publications were accessible to them. People who were blind wanted to be able to use their screen readers. People with low vision wanted to be able to enlarge the characters and adjust the visual representation. And people with learning differences, such as dyslexia, well, they benefit from being able to choose the colours, personalise the font and spacing, and to have highlighting while hearing the text read to them. And EPUB is for accessible content. EPUB's based on the technologies of the open web platform, technologies such as HTML and cascading style sheets. And these technologies have accessibility features in there, and these are inherited in the EPUB format. So this provides, for example, scalable fonts and reflow. So just as we're used to modern websites being responsive to smaller screens, EPUB will work on all size screens without the need to pan and zoom left and right in order to see the full width of the line. It also provides the ability to change the foreground and background colours, the margins and line spacing, and to choose a preferred font and adjust the font size. And for people using a screen reader, well, if they have familiar commands they're used to using the web, so for example, the ability to be able to jump between headings, to navigate around a table, to read the alt text, to escape from a list, these same commands will work within an EPUB because it is just web type content. And because EPUB has been designed for publications from the ground up, it provides excellent navigation features, even for the most complex titles. So it provides, for example, a table of contents, print page navigation, the ability to use hyperlinks to jump around within a publication, and to endnotes. It provides for bookmarking, search, and more. And an important thing to think about here is that EPUBs are not made accessible after the fact. The standard itself has accessibility kind of baked in. So when an book is born digital, it can be born accessible. So where are we in EPUB in 2020, the year I'm making this presentation? Well, the publishing industry has embraced EPUB as their bedrock of digital book publishing all around the world. It's an international format for all sorts of languages and scripts. And if we think about consumer ebooks, so novels, the bestseller list, and so on, nearly 100% of these consumer ebooks are made as EPUB. If you're reading ebook through a ebook store, the chances are those ebooks are made from EPUB. EPUB has also made great inroads into higher education with its ability to contain images and tables, complex content such as maths and so on. So in the States, it's said that some 80% of newer higher education textbooks are produced in EPUB 3. Now, lots of content in education is available on websites. So, for example, you might have a journal database and the ability to read journal articles as HTML. But what if you want to download that article and keep it on your hard drive and read it sometime later when you're offline? Well, HTML isn't such a great offline format, but EPUB packages up that HTML and provides it in a navigable format. So increasingly, you'll see EPUB is being offered as the download format for HTML content such as journal articles. And as well as published books, you'll see publications coming from government and non-governmental organizations where they're producing maybe a brochure or a big report or something like that. EPUB will be one of the options that is offered. So let's talk about the EPUB standards. Well, EPUB was developed by an organization previously called the International Digital Publishers Forum, IDPF. But in fact, the work's now been taken under the wing of W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, the organization responsible for the standards of the web. The current version of EPUB is 3.2, and this was the approved recommendation dating back to May 2019. So it's stable and it's up to date. And part of that recommendation is the statement that an EPUB should conform to the EPUB accessibility specification, which sets out the minimum requirements for what makes an accessible EPUB. So, for example, the HTML conforming to WCAG standards, it containing accessibility metadata, and some other properties too. EPUB is well on the way to becoming an ISO standard. We expect that to be happening really quite soon. So let's talk about some important developments that are happening right now with EPUB, and I wanted to call out three. First is, I mentioned on the last slide that accessible EPUB can contain metadata on accessibility. What does this mean? It means that before you even download an EPUB, you're able to discover the accessibility properties of that digital publication. So does it, for example, have described images? Does it contain accessible math? Are there accessibility hazards in there? And this type of accessibility metadata is now displayed on some ebook platforms where you would look to buy or borrow ebooks. But what has been discovered is that displaying the metadata isn't so friendly. So a user experience guide is being developed for the makers of these platforms in how to interpret the metadata and display it in a human-friendly form. So that's the user experience guide for displaying accessibility metadata. So if, for example, you're interested in looking for an EPUB that is screen reader friendly, that should be really obvious to you when you find the title. Next thing I want to mention is mathematics, and maths expressions have been something that have been a real challenge for accessibility for, well, time immemorial. Well, now there are various techniques that can be used for including math within an EPUB, and having conducted extensive testing with the reading systems and with the assistive technology, there are now some recommendations for publishers and people who make EPUB as to how to include mathematics within a publication. And we're all familiar with the concept of alt text, where a short bit of text can describe the intention of an image included on a web page or in a publication, but sometimes that's just not enough. So now there are some recommendations for best practices for including extended descriptions. So let's take a look at EPUB in action. We'll take a look at a couple of EPUBs, and we'll use an app on Windows, which is free. It's called Thorium Reader. And we'll start by looking at visual adjustments that might be useful for someone with low vision or with a reading difference such as dyslexia. And then after that, we'll look at reading the EPUB in Thorium Reader using the free Windows screen reader called NVDA. I'll start the Thorium Reader by clicking on the icon on my desktop. And the app starts in the library view where the publications I have already added are displayed for me. To keep things simple, I'll pick the first one in the list so I can get reading. Okay, let's go into settings to see what options I have for changing the colours. The first option is called Theme, where I can choose between neutral, black text on white, sepia, for a low contrast, low glare option, and night, high contrast with white text on a black background. Next, well, this text is pretty small, so let's increase it. We do this through the next option in the settings menu under text. Here there's a slider, and as we move it, the text size changes dynamically, so we know when we've got to the level we're happy with. As you would expect, the page display adjusts to the new size so that the text neatly reflows to fit in the width of the window. Next, let's look at the fonts available to us. Here they are, just under text size, and we have 8 options. This includes the default font for the ebook, a choice of serif and sans serif fonts, and a dyslexia-specific font which is called Readable. Options for spacing are helpful in that these enable someone to personalize the presentation of the text on the display. Thorium Reader has plenty of options for spacing control, so the line length can be shortened by increasing the margin. The spacing between the lines can be increased and even adjusted between words and individual letters, so that's pretty comprehensive. We also have control over whether we want to override the publisher settings for justification and whether we want 1 or 2 columns of text shown on the display, so that's nice to see. Okay, so having looked at the visual adjustments that are available within a typical EPUB reader, let's now look at the screen reading experience. Okay, let's start reading this book.
Down arrow. Heading Level 1 Worst Ocean Disaster in World's History. Titanic goes down. 1,341 lives are lost.
So it read me this heading and it told me it was heading level 1. Let's keep reading.
Down arrow. Graphic painting of a ship sinking by the bow, with people rowing a lifeboat in the foreground and other. Down arrow. Graphic people in the water. Icebergs are visible in the background.
So here it told me that it had reached a graphic, and then it read to me the alt text, the description of what this painting is about. The person that created this publication has entered the alt text to describe each image. Let's keep reading.
Down arrow. Untergang der Titanic. Sinking of the Titanic, by Willie Stower, 1912.
It's read me the caption of this painting, and maybe you noticed, the caption is actually German, and it switched to the German voice before continuing in the English voice. I'm keeping reading with down arrow.
Down arrow. Heading level 2 background.
So I'm going to press H and it'll read me the next heading and move to that spot in the book.
Starting out heading level 2. The 14th of April, 1912 heading level 2. Iceberg warnings, heading level 3. Iceberg, right ahead. 2339, heading level 3.
So as I keep pressing H, it's moving me from heading to heading.
Effects of the collision heading level 3. The 15th of April, 1912 heading level 2.
Now it's telling me the heading level each time it reaches it. I can also use the number keys to move to the previous or next heading of that level. So 2 will move me to the next heading level 2, Shift 2 will move me to the previous heading level 2, and 1 will move me to the next heading level 1, and Shift 1 will move me to the previous heading level 1. So I'm going to see if I can find the next heading level 3.
Preparing to evacuate heading level 3. Departure of the lifeboats, 00:4502:05, heading level 3.
Now if the book is organized using hierarchical heading structures, this makes it very powerful for moving through the content. So that's the keystroke to move heading by heading. There are other ways of moving through as well. So G will move me to the next graphic.
Photograph of a bearded man wearing a white captain's uniform, standing on a ship with his arms crossed.
And I'm going to move to the next graphic.
Illustration of a weeping woman being comforted by a man on the sloping deck of a ship. In the background, men are loading other women into a lifeboat. Graphic.
And I can move between links with K.
http://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/sinking of the RMS Titanic number site ref ship time 10 link.
The L key will move me to a list.
List with 3 items bullet. Down arrow. Less than a third of those aboard Titanic survived the disaster.
And as I moved into the list, it told me I was in a list and how many items are there. Once in a list, I can move between the items with I and Shift I. That moves me through item by item.
Bullet, some survivors died shortly afterwards.
Now, if I'm in a really long list, the comma key will jump me out of a list and carry on reading.
Of the groups shown in the table, 49% of the children, 26% of the female passengers, 82% of the...
Let's do some reading of a table. So I'm going to use T to move to a table.
With 9 rows
And once in the table, I can use my screen reader commands to move around the table and also to read out the column or row header. So that's about the standard and the technology, but let's think about where EPUB is actually being used. Well, I mentioned before that EPUB is used extensively in higher education, and on the screen here I'm calling out the names of some publishers who produce textbooks for university level education. So this includes Macmillan Learning, W.W. Norton, Kogan Page, Pearson and Wiley. And the reason why I'm mentioning these is that these companies all submitted titles to something that's called the Publishers Face-Off, where their titles of a recently produced book are examined by accessibility experts and people with reading disabilities, and they get feedback on how they've done and whether they've included all the features that people would want. It has been amazing, the quality of content that's been provided to this Publisher Face-Off scheme. And the standard of entries has been really, really high. And the publishers are not choosing the simple titles. They're submitting textbooks in fields of physics and mathematics and biology and so on. And it's amazing the work that they're building into ebooks so that when they reach any student, they've got the accessibility already built in. And I mentioned that the publishers wanted a single file format to go into different channels. On this screen, I'm demonstrating how one publisher talked about how their ebooks are sent to multiple platforms. So this includes regular ebook platforms that a consumer might use, such as Kobo, Apple Books, Google Books, or Kindle, but also the more education-focused platforms such as eBook Central, VitalSource Bookshelf, RedShelf and EBSCO. And lastly, interesting that these ebooks are also making their way to the specialist distributors for people with print disabilities. So in the US, for example, the Access Text Network and Bookshare, and in the UK, RNIB Bookshare. So what about some resources for learning about EPUB? Well, actually, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to suggest that you go along to the website inclusivepublishing.org, which is a definitive resource for people from various sectors, including publishing, the developers of reading apps, people from the education sector and end users. And it includes all sorts of wonderful content, such as the guidelines and standards, the tools that can be used to validate content, the testing of reading apps. There's news from the industry, information about upcoming events, and articles, videos, tutorials, and more. So if you go along to that website, you can read the content that's posted there at the moment, and you can sign up for updates. And if you want to take a next step with EPUB, well, if you're a publisher, I'd really encourage you to join the Publishers Association Accessibility Action Group. This is a group of like-minded folk from the publishing industry and from disability organisations and from the education world, working together to drive accessible publishing and reading in the UK forwards. If you want to make your own EPUB, well, the simplest way is to create a structured document within Google Docs, make sure it's got headings and alt text on the images, and then simply do download as EPUB. If you want to use Microsoft Word, then grab the free Word to EPUB tool from the DAISY website, make yourself a structured Word document, and then create a wonderful EPUB, which you can then try out using different reading experiences. If you have an iPhone or iPad or Mac, you can use Apple Books. So if you have an EPUB and just click on it, that will open in that app. It's built into the ships with the operating system. Similarly, if you're using Android, and you get an EPUB, then it will open in Google Books. If you're using a desktop computer, why not download a copy of Thorium Reader, which you can use on the Mac and on Windows, and see how you get along with that. Thanks for listening to the presentation. I hope you found this and the other introduction presentations from UKAAF to be useful.
Hello, welcome to the introduction to accessible Office documents. My name is Jeff Mills. I'm a board member of UKAAF, and I'm also co-founder of a company called GrackleDocs that helps with accessibility out of Google G Suite. So we're going to cover a few things today about accessible Office documents, and notably it's the law. Talk a little about what are Office documents, the general rules around Office documents, and then accessibility within Office software itself. So to cover it to start with, we have to realize that it's estimated that up to 4% of the population relies on some sort of assistive technology to look at electronic documents and web pages. So it could be screen reading software or braille displays or screen magnifiers. If electronic documents aren't created with accessibility in mind, they become extremely difficult, if not impossible, to read or navigate by a large number of people. Importantly, accessibility to electronic documents is a right that's protected by law in pretty much every country in the world. It ensures access for persons with disabilities. Companies are protected against legal action, and it's just good business. There's a large segment of population that can equally participate and take advantage of the products and services that are on offer. So let's look at a bit of Office document software. Well, there's many pieces of software out there. There's the two giants in Microsoft and Google. And I think Google G Suite is just renaming to Google Workplace, but it's the same thing. But there are also other document software out there, Zoho, Polaris, LibreOffice, and so on, that produced documents of some sort. Today, we're going to focus on a couple of areas. One is general accessibility within documents and go through some guidelines there, but then we'll go deeper into things like Google and Microsoft to see how they may work through their accessibility guidelines. So one of the main things in Office documents in accessibility is ensure that you have headings. Headings provide context and a way to navigate through a document for users of assistive technologies. And don't think that just by making a line bold 20 point, it becomes a heading. That's not true. You have to use the styles that are involved to make a styled heading. That way the screen reader can actually work out what a heading is and make the user run through the document far more easily, jumping from heading to heading or up and down to headings. Headings should be selected based on the hierarchy. So you'll start with heading 1, you'll go to heading 2, and maybe heading 3. But from heading 3, you don't jump to heading 5. So you have to run up and down the headings in accordance with their numbers. So heading 1 to heading 2 to heading 3, possibly back to heading 1, but not from heading 1 to heading 3. And items of equal importance should be equal level headings. So if a subheading 3 is being used and then the next item is of similar value, heading 3 should be used again. Images, very important. Always add alternative text, or otherwise known as alt text, to the image. And that can be for images, charts, graphs, and sometimes tables to ensure that the user with visual impairments can access the information that's included within these visuals. And the text there should provide sufficient information so that anyone who's unable to see them can still understand the position they're trying to convey. There are no hard and fast rules here of what it should say, because it depends on the image, the context, the intent the author may have had. But one simple trick is to imagine describing the image to someone over the phone. The more important the image content, the more descriptive the alternative text should be. Color contrast is very important too. It's essential that there's an appropriate contrast between the text and background. And in very general terms, lightly colored text should have a darker background and darkly colored text should have a lighter background. There are other rules around this for all sorts of abilities, but as a general rule, make sure that the contrast is high. Lists are really important. A bit like headings. A list is a tool that's like a bulleted or numbered list that screen readers can effectively read back to someone that they're part of a group. Manually inserting any of the list items won't help. Any numbered list that has multiple layers should use a different number scheme for each level so that lists of things can be easily discerned between each other. And then general legibility. Make sure to make your document as easy to read, not only for those with assisted technologies, but for everybody. Sans serif fonts generally are considered more legible for monitors than soft serif fonts. And generally color plays an important role. The color scheme itself should have a contrast between light and dark without being too extreme. Too little or too much contrast can make the document difficult to read for those who are colorblind or with low vision. And then certain color combinations of bright colors can cause headaches and make it uncomfortable to read in the way it's been laid out. Even the most able sighted person can see that on television sometimes if very gaudy colors are used for too long, how hard that becomes to read. We can go beyond documents. What about presentations and spreadsheets, which are documents of types, but they're handled slightly differently? So if we look at PowerPoint and slides, for instance, they're the kind of slideshows of which I'm showing you one here. It's all the things that we mentioned before, but some extra things in there as well. So try to avoid those lovely transitions and animations if possible. I know they're pretty fun sometimes, but if you can try and reduce those to minimum, that's really helpful. Then we go back to the font and font sizes that we were talking before. Try and use sans serif fonts. Arial and Verdana are good examples of those. But try and make sure that the minimum font size on a PowerPoint presentation is 20 points. So 20 points and above is a good angle to start on your PowerPoint or slides shows. Make sure the color contrast, as we were talking before, there is sufficient color contrast in all slides, and don't use colors just as a way to convey content because it won't be read back to someone. So you need to be more descriptive on how something, the content needs to be conveyed. When adding tables, only use the simplest of data tables. Data tables being read back to someone is very complex anyway, and the software normally has quite a job to try and make sure it's read back in the correct way. And then further on, things like embedded multimedia. If you've embedded a movie, make sure that it's captioned and that the player controls are accessible. If we look at Excel or sheets, spreadsheets, again, simple is good. Break down complex data sets into logical tables, ideally within the same worksheet. Reserve the first worksheet for a contents or index page. So if you've got multiple sheets in your spreadsheet, make sure that there is a worksheet that defines what's out in the rest of them. Insert all text and data with the logical path that a keyboard user would take. So as a general rule, the keyboard owner will navigate from A1 cell until a table is reached. Avoid empty cells as much as you possibly can. Otherwise, someone is spacing through empty cells to try and find information. You need to adjust the cell height and width to ensure all the text you appear is visible in your spreadsheet. Try not to hide any text underneath those cells. Make sure that you're adding alt text to charts and graphics as before. Avoid using the visual devices such as color and shading to divide up data regions, because again, that won't be read back to someone. An important one is try to avoid merging data or header cells. It causes navigation problems and it's very hard to work out what row matches what column header, etc. And then finally, when you actually save your spreadsheet, make sure the focus is on cell A1, unless you specifically want a user to open it up with a very specific cell in mind. So they're just general rules that are out there, but actually we went back to the beginning of the conversation here with there is Microsoft Office and Google G Suite. They have some accessibility options that can help you along your way rather than trying to remember all of these tips. In Microsoft Office, there's an inbuilt accessibility checker. And in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, you can select Review, Check Accessibility, and look at your results. And it will show you a list of errors, warnings, and tips how to fix and recommend each of those. And here's an option here that this is the kind of accessibility checker comes up and says there's a merged or split cell in this case, so you need to look at, and it helps you with what to fix and how to fix it. In G Suite, there's a third-party accessibility checker, and at the beginning I said I'm co-founder of a company called GrackleDocs. We are the third-party accessibility checker for Google G Suite. There isn't one built in, and we've created an add-on for docs, sheets, and slides. In the end, it works quite similarly to the Microsoft version of an accessibility checker, but there's a couple of extra steps to make sure that you've got this on your Google G Suite implementation. So you need to install the add-ons to start with. So in Docs sheet, if you're in a doc, a sheet, or a slide, select add-ons and manage add-ons, type Grackle and install the add-on that's there. And then once installed, Grackle can be launched from the add-ons menu. And when it launches, it will scan through your document and give you feedback on accessibility and how to remediate. And it'll also allow you to export to an accessible PDF as well. And that's what I wanted to say for accessible Office documents today. I hope that's been informative, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Hello, welcome to the UKAAF Introduction to Large Print for TechShare Pro 2020. My name is David Scott. I'm MD at Vision Support Trading Limited, a UK-based transcription supplier. I'm also a board member of UKAAF and the board lead for large print. So here's briefly what we want to cover in this introduction to large print. Firstly, what is large print? What do we mean by large print? It might seem obvious, but it isn't necessarily quite as obvious as it seems. What are the large print standards, and particularly what are the minimum standards recommended by UKAAF? We look at some resources for learning in more detail about large print. A brief look at technology for producing large print and its evolution, and then we'll look at some examples of large print provision for very different applications. Then summarize all that before looking at how you can take the next steps with large print. I should stress that what this introduction looks at is very much hard copy large print. So as a large print document in their hand. It isn't looking at electronic documents that you might be sent, which you could use with screen readers and perhaps or even manipulate the text yourself. But we do have other resources available through UKAAF if that's what you're interested in. So first of all, what is large print? The term large print can be a bit of an oversimplification. Clear print or modified large print are also terms often used in the industry that you might hear. Now, anyone with a visual, cognitive or physical impairment that hinders the ability to read hard copy print may require that print in an accessible format. So I think the critical thing to note is that simply raising the font size to, for example, 16, 18 or 20 point is only part of the answer. Otherwise, we would just simply recommend blowing documents up from A4 to A3. Vision impairment is not just about short-sightedness. So there are various other more complicated vision impairments such as macular degeneration, tunnel vision, that sort of thing, where you do really need to simplify the layout. So text and layout must also be clear, which may require the document to be modified. So hence the term clear print or modified large print. Large print standards. Unlike some accessible format areas such as PDF or Braille, there are really no internationally recognized bodies defining large print standards. Organisations like ourselves therefore tend to produce guidance rather than standards. And this presentation is based on the UKAAF guidance G003, creating clear print and large print documents. Now, this was revised and simplified in 2019 following the creation of specific guidance on a number of other areas such as accessible images. So the document itself is quite long, G003, over 30 pages, and we will give you a link to that on the UKAAF website later. But very briefly, it does provide some bullet points on the key suggestions. So minimum text size 16 point or ideally 18. Try to use a legible sans serif typeface such as Calibri or Arial rather than a serif font such as Times New Roman. Try and provide good contrast between the text and the background, so no text overlapping images, non-glossy paper, sufficient weight to avoid any show through of print from the other side. So we tend to recommend ideally black text on a white background. No information conveyed solely through colour, images or diagrams. If possible, no italics, underlining or large blocks of capital letters. Page numbers, labels, superscripts, etc. should ideally be in the same font size as the main text. Single line spacing, left aligned. Horizontal text, ideally one blank line between paragraphs at the same point size as the text. Words and single pieces of information, ideally not split onto two lines wherever possible. Columns avoided or reduced in number. If columns are used, there is space between them and possibly a vertical dividing line. And the guidance does give you a bit more information that we haven't got time to look at here as to why those things are necessary for some people with vision impairment. It'd also be well worth your while to have a look at vision awareness training to understand a little bit more about that. But basically making print clear is much more than just increasing the font size, and in some cases may have to be tailored to the individual user. So if you want to find out more detail about this, UKAAF have got some resources which you can find on our website, www.ukaaf.org/standards. Particularly G003, creating clear and large print documents from 2019. It's also worth looking at G021, large print, making images and diagrams accessible, again revised in 2019. A brief look at technology for producing large print. The user only really cares that he's got his document in large print. He doesn't really care how you get there. But it's worth understanding over the years there's been a number of technologies that have been employed to transcribe documents into clear and large print. So in the very beginning, we might have looked at copy typing. This is literally typing the whole document out again. This is obviously time consuming. It's also expensive, therefore, and it's also prone to human error. For documents where there's a lot of, you're doing multiple copies and there's a lot of similar text, template typing is often employed. This saves a lot of time, but again, you've got to potential for human error. You've also got to make sure that the standard text that you might be having in the template, such as terms and conditions, haven't changed. Scanning is and optical character recognition is a technology that people have used when a hard copy of the original is available. Scanning the text in, extracting it by using optical character recognition. Obviously, this is a lot quicker and cheaper than someone typing the whole document in again. It does have some drawbacks. Optical character recognition, you avoid human error, but it does have its own errors. So the classic being recognizing the difference, for example, between a 1, a lowercase l, or a capital I. So again, not perfect. If you can get the original document in a PDF, as it's an extractable PDF rather than just an image PDF, it should be possible to extract the exact text from it without those problems of optical character recognition. There are some other drawbacks, but in theory, you should be able to then reformat the text into the exact text into the font size, etc., that you need for your user. And we have another presentation in this series on PDF, and it's worth looking at that because PDF UA even allows you to make sure that the text is extracted in the right order and reconfigured in the right order. And then finally, there's things like direct data feeds. Now, all of these remain legitimate approaches depending on how you receive the source document and the volumes involved. You may get a hard copy rather than a PDF. It may not be worth setting up an automated process if you're doing something one-off. So a couple of examples to illustrate that are worth looking at. Example 1, you're providing or transcribing course material for a vision impaired university student. The source material may or may not be easy to extract the text from. You may only have a hard copy textbook, for example. You may have written notes from a lecturer. It's also likely to be a one-off requirement, which is going to reduce the potential for automation. But however, if it is a one-off requirement, then the font size, etc., can be tailored to that individual user. And this is a good illustration of why we tend to talk about this as guidance rather than standards. If you're doing this kind of work and your user wants 20-point font or 24-point font, give them that, rather than be wedded to whatever it says in the UKAAF guidance. Now, at the other extreme, another example here, you might be transcribing several hundred statements a day for a bank's vision impaired customers and having to turn that work around within 24 hours. So the source material is much more likely to be easy to extract the text from. You may be getting PDF. So there should be significant potential for automation. But on the other hand, you don't know the individual users. They're all different. You may have to settle on a standardized font size, etc. So basically, you need to decide in that case. In summary, the key points to note regarding clear and large print. Making hard copy documents accessible is not just about increasing the size of the font. There are no hard and fast standards, only guidance. So suppliers should try to meet the needs of the individual users, and where that's not possible, provide something acceptable to as many users as reasonably possible. Technological developments have allowed us to improve both the accuracy and lead time when transcribing documents to accessible format. So it's worth thinking about what the best way to do it is in your case. So finally, just some next steps. If you want to find out more about large print or getting started in it, we've given the web address there for our standards and guidance, www.ukaaf.org/standards. If you're looking for somebody to help you with transcription, UKAAF have a members page. I've given the web address there, www.ukaaf.org/membership/sponsoring members. And finally, if you have any questions about this, please feel free to email us at inquiries@ukaaf.org. So thank you for listening, and I hope that that's provided some guidance as to how to get started with large print documents.